Today's video is potentially the beginning of a new series, which I'm calling my Hot Take series. Every basketball fan has some hot takes, which I define as opinions that go against the consensus thinking of the basketball community. Getting you to respect my unpopular conclusions may be difficult, and I fully expect some of my most disliked videos to come from this series. But regardless, it might get us all to think, and could contribute to some good basketball conversations. Most people agree about who's the best of the best, as Magic Johnson was a 5-time champion, is the all-time leader in assists per game, and has several of the greatest performances of NBA Finals history. You'll get no argument from me concerning the top spot. But as for third overall, that one is an absolute dogfight with point guards like John Stockton, Chris Paul, Gary Payton, Oscar Robertson, Jason Kidd, Steve Nash, and of course, Isaiah Thomas. First off, let me establish the kind of player that Isaiah Thomas was. He stood 6 foot 1 inches tall and was drafted in 1981 with the second overall pick by the Detroit Pistons. He played 13 seasons in the NBA and played only until the age of 32, when his career ended with an Achilles tear. More on this in a bit. Isaiah was one of the greatest ball handlers of NBA history, and with his incredible quickness and agility, he was extremely difficult to defend. Isaiah was also one of the greatest dual-threat point guards the game has ever seen, as he could dominate you with his explosive scoring, or he could completely control the game with his elite facilitating. In his career, he averaged 19.2 points, 9.3 assists, and 3.6 rebounds on 45.2% shooting. He was a 12-time All-Star, a 2-time NBA champion, and was the 1990 Finals MVP. During his individual prime in 1985, he averaged 21.2 points and 13.9 assists, which made him one out of only 3 players to ever average over 20 points and over 12 assists in the same season. His 13.9 assists was the highest single-season average of anyone in NBA history not named John Stockton. And again, Stockton was never close to being the type of scorer that Isaiah Thomas was. Think of the greatest point guards of all time. How many of them can take over a game offensively like Isaiah can, who also averaged north of 10 assists per game? How many of them could dominate a playoff game with 15 assists and follow it up the next game with a 35-point performance? John Stockton couldn't do that, Steph Curry couldn't do that, Steve Nash couldn't do that, and neither could Jason Kidd or Gary Payton. But that was a common occurrence for Isaiah Thomas, and that should tell you just how special of a player he was. It wasn't uncommon for him to run the floor like John Stockton for 3 quarters, and then play like Michael Jordan in the 4th quarter if that's what his team needed, as Zeke had some of the most dominant postseason performances of league history. Like when he scored a scorching 16 points in the final 94 seconds of an elimination game against the New York Knicks in 1984. Or how about when he severely sprained his ankle in Game 6 of the 1988 NBA Finals, and instead of sitting out like many would have, he stayed in the game, and dropped 25 points in the 3rd quarter alone, which is still the record for the most points ever scored in a quarter of an NBA Finals game. He finished that game with an incredible 43 points, 8 assists, and 6 steals on 56% shooting from the field. Again, this came from a player who has the highest seasonal assist per game average other than John Stockton. I just don't think people wrap their minds around how truly incredible that is. Isaiah earned his 2 championships, as he was one of the most clutch performers the game has ever seen. Detroit fans would probably like me to remind you that if it wasn't for a terrible foul call in the closing moments of Game 6 of the 1988 NBA Finals, which has become known as the Phantom Foul, then the Isaiah Thomas-led Pistons would have won 3 straight championships, and would have been the first to have done it since the Celtics dynasty in the 1960s. I've said it once and I'll say it again, but I believe Isaiah Thomas is the 3rd greatest point guard in NBA history. Now, most people don't agree with this statement, and I believe there are several reasons for this. For one, during the best seasons of his career, he played in the league against Magic Johnson and Larry Bird, who had a rivalry that the league was obsessed with promoting, and he also played against a young and rising Michael Jordan, who was certainly being groomed by the league and the media to be an icon and the face of the NBA. When that is the kind of icons and circumstances you're up against, well then it's no wonder how Isaiah Thomas has become so overshadowed in league history. Second is how unpopular his Detroit Pistons were in the late 80s. Almost every basketball fan outside of Detroit hated the Pistons during that era because of their extra level of physicality and their on-the-court antics. Now, whether or not you like Isaiah Thomas from a personal standpoint is up to you, but regardless, that doesn't change the reality of how good he was as a basketball player. It just changes whether or not people choose to acknowledge it. Lastly, the third reason why I think people don't put Isaiah as high on the list as I do is because his career totals aren't as high as many of the all-time great point guards. But there's context that needs to be acknowledged here. Personally, when I'm looking at and deciding my all-time great rankings, I care less about a player's career totals, and instead, I put more stock in how good the players were when they were at their best. And Isaiah was almost as good as it gets at the point guard position during his prime years. He only played until the age of 32, and if he had played longer, you would see him right around the top of many lists. When you look at his 979 games against the first 979 games of some of the great competition at point guard, you can begin to see just how much Isaiah stands out among the crowd. I've been doing this NBA YouTube thing for a few years now, and since I've started, I've got hundreds if not thousands of video requests. One of the most common and reoccurring video requests is who do I think is the most overrated player in NBA history. Everyone seems to have their choice as to who they believe is the most overrated NBA player, and I gotta admit, that would certainly make for a good hot take video if I had one. My hot take may even be hotter than suggesting that a great player is overrated. My opinion is that the term overrated is overrated. It essentially boils down to what the word itself means and how I think some of you guys aren't giving the basketball community enough credit. Let's take a player like Russell Westbrook for example. He's an incredibly talented and athletically gifted player. I could easily make a video where I go on and on explaining how impressive Russell Westbrook is. But as great as he does have some shortcomings as a basketball player. He's consistently among the league leaders in turnovers, which brings his decision-making and self-control into question. He's an extremely poor perimeter shooter, yet continues to take a high volume of three-point shots. And he's been known to be a guy who looks to pad his stats, especially in terms of his rebounds, as there's visual evidence of his teammates backing off to allow him to grab the rebounds. It's these shortcomings that have led many basketball fans to call him overrated throughout the years. But this is where my point comes in. All of these shortcomings of Russell Westbrook are common knowledge amongst your typical NBA fans. So if everyone recognizes his shortcomings and ranks him accordingly, what in the world warrants him being called overrated? How about a highly debated player like John Stockton? He's an NBA Hall of Famer, the all-time leader in assists and steals, and a player who's never missed the NBA playoffs. According to this viewer's take, John Stockton appears to be extremely underrated. But then again, according to this viewer's take, John Stockton appears to be extremely overrated. Now, what do these two opinions have in common? Neither of them are the consensus opinion of the basketball community as a whole. Most people have John Stockton as a top 5 point guard of all time, so that should be the basis on whether or not we consider him an underrated or an overrated player, and not based on the outlier opinions of a very small group of people. Kobe Bryant is yet another example of a player who's sometimes called overrated based off of the opinions of a very tiny group of people. There are some diehard Laker fans who call Kobe the greatest player of all time, and you're gonna be hard pressed to find anyone who loves the Mamba more than I do. But with that being said, even I can recognize that Kobe Bryant doesn't have the strongest argument. He averaged less points than Michael Jordan while being less efficient. He also had less championships, significantly less MVPs and finals MVPs, and the one thing he did better than anything else was score the basketball, but he amassed less than half the amount of scoring titles that Michael Jordan did. Most people recognize these details like I do. Calling Kobe Bryant the GOAT isn't a popular stance that many people take, but it doesn't stop Kobe Bryant haters from pointing out the most passionate Kobe fans and using them as an example of why Kobe is overrated. Again, when you look at the consensus viewpoints of players like Russell Westbrook, John Stockton, and Kobe Bryant, I believe they are properly rated because the basketball community as a whole is more knowledgeable than is typically given credit for. I even considered naming this video something a bit bolder and saying that players being overrated is a myth. But I thought about it a little longer and decided that the statement probably isn't true in every instance. My point remains the same. that people are too quick to give negative labels based on something that isn't even how the players are actually perceived on a widespread level. For those of you who've been subbed to this channel for a while, you've probably never heard me call a single player overrated. But you have heard me call plenty of players underrated, which begs the question, why is this? Why do I have what seems like a weird double standard? Well, it's because the aspect of underrated is a little different than overrated, because a player being underrated is almost always tied to people's ignorance. I'm not using the word ignorance to mean anything negative, but I simply mean it in a very literal sense. How can a young fan possibly properly rate an old school player if they've never seen his highlights, are not aware of his skill set, or if they've never even heard of that player? Take a guy like Sidney Moncrief for example. He was arguably the best defensive player during his prime, as he's the only guard to ever win the Defensive Player of the Year award multiple times. He was an incredibly gifted athlete and was a reliable and incredibly efficient scorer, especially by point guard standards. This is a guy who's incredibly underrated, but he's not underrated because of how he was perceived during his playing days. Anyone who actually witnessed him play can tell you all about how great he was as a basketball player. The reason he's underrated is literally due to ignorance, as many younger fans don't even know this guy exists, so of course they can't possibly understand the extent of his greatness, and as a result, he's talked about less than he deserves as time goes on. If you're a young basketball fan who knows all about the greatness of Sidney Moncrief, then hats off to you. But also understand that you're an anomaly, and you certainly don't represent the majority of basketball fans your age. When we discuss a player being overrated, the element of ignorance isn't really there, but instead, we're just claiming that most people don't have an accurate perspective on that player's abilities. But I would argue that more often than not, most people actually do. Some people might not see this as a hot take, but when you consider the fact that almost everyone has at least one player that they believe is very overrated, and I don't, then you can at least begin to see how this thought isn't necessarily the most popular conclusion. If you have a player who you believe is overrated, then I'm gonna ask you to pause and honestly consider whether or not that opinion is influenced by the basketball community as a whole, or if it's influenced by the opinions of that player's most hardcore fans. Over the course of LeBron's 18-year career so far, there have been many incredible performances in the postseason, but most of the time, several games are often selected by fans and analysts as the greatest performance of his career. Among these most commonly are Game 6 of the 2012 Eastern Conference Finals, where he rose to the occasion in a must-win situation and dominated the Boston Celtics with 45 points, 15 rebounds, and 5 assists on ridiculous efficiency. Then of course, there's Game 7 of the 2016 NBA Finals, where LeBron completed the historic 3-1 comeback over the 73-9 Warriors with a massive triple-double and with arguably the most clutch block shot in basketball history. When you ask most basketball fans, and when you look at most lists online, these two are usually the games selected as the greatest performances of LeBron's career. But as great as those two were, I disagree. In my opinion, the greatest performance of LeBron's career came much earlier, in what was a significant step towards his all-time great legacy. If I'm going to have any chance of convincing you, first, I'll need to paint the picture of that time frame, and I'll need to break down the events that took place. The year is 2007. LeBron James was entering his 4th season in the NBA as only a 21-year-old player. Although we could already see much of LeBron's potential, he was still yet to have a signature moment in the postseason, and most people in the NBA community thought the Cavs were years away from being title contenders. After all, the most frequent starting five for the Cavs that season was LeBron James, Larry Hughes, Eric Snow, Drew Gooden, and Zydrunas Ilgauskas. Not your typical championship supporting cast. Despite the lack of superstar support, the young LeBron still led his Cavaliers to a 50-32 record and the 2nd seed in the Eastern Conference. Throughout the regular season, LeBron averaged 27.6 points, 6 assists, and 6.7 rebounds on 47.6% shooting. Finishing 2nd through the regular season with that supporting cast was an incredible accomplishment by itself, but LeBron's legendary moment was still ahead of him. He dominated the first round against Gilbert Arenas and the Washington Wizards, sweeping them in 4 games. In the second round, the Cavs defeated a more talented New Jersey Nets team in 6 games, who were led by Jason Kidd, Vince Carter, and Richard Jefferson. That's as far as anyone expected these Cavs to go, because waiting for them in the Eastern Conference Finals were the heavily favored Detroit Pistons, a team who had finished with the best record in the East for the past 2 seasons and had made the conference finals for 5 straight seasons. Detroit was rich with talent, led by former Finals MVP Chauncey Billups, and he had help from other All-Stars like Richard Hamilton, Rasheed Wallace, and Tayshaun Prince. Simply put, these Detroit Pistons were the reigning power in the Eastern Conference. They were experienced, proven, and battle-tested. Again, no one outside of Cleveland actually expected this inexperienced Cavs team to prevail over the Pistons. But after 4 hard-fought close games, the series was tied at 2 games apiece, with the series moving back to Detroit, where the pivotal 5th game was about to take place. The game continued with the trend of the series. It was a close and hard-fought game throughout. Many players on both sides were contributing, that is, until the final 3 minutes of the 4th quarter, and from this point on, it would be all LeBron James for the Cleveland Cavaliers. He was only 22 years old at this point, and he was taking over offensively in a way that we've never seen before. The young LeBron was hitting basically every kind of shot on the court, from poster dunks to highly contested jumpers. He displayed one of the most clutch, unstoppable offensive onslaughts of all time, dragging his Cavs through the final minutes of the 4th quarter, through the first overtime, and through the second overtime. After yet another clutch 3 to tie the game with just over a minute remaining, Steve Kerr, who was calling the game and was a longtime teammate of Michael Jordan, said that "This is unbelievable. This is Jordan-esque." And then, with the ball in his hands with only seconds remaining, LeBron drove through the heart of the Pistons' elite defense and scored the game-winning basket, capping off his legendary night in a 109-107 victory. He finished the game with 48 points, 9 rebounds, and 7 assists. From the final 2 minutes and 48 seconds of the 4th quarter to the end of the second overtime, LeBron was the only Cavalier who scored, incredibly dropping the final 25 points for his team. During that stretch, he shot 11 of 13 from the field, while the rest of the Cavaliers were a combined 0 of 6 from the field with several turnovers. LeBron is known to dominate games in various ways, with his scoring in combination with his facilitating and rebounding. But rarely do we see LeBron take over a game completely offensively. Sure, Steve Kerr called it Jordan-esque, but the truth is, his 25 straight points to close out a playoff game is something that Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, Larry Bird, and basically no other great has ever done. And again, this came from a 22-year-old to close out the most important game of his life up to that point, as he was dethroning that era's dominant team of the conference. If you look up the definition of the word carrying, a photo of this game should come up. With this iconic Game 5 performance, LeBron single-handedly took the momentum of the series, and the Cavs easily closed out the Pistons in the 6th game, and LeBron made his first of 10 NBA Finals appearances. I think some of the other great performances are often selected as LeBron's best simply because they were more recent, and more young fans were able to witness it. Plus, more people in general were paying attention to LeBron's legacy at that point. But unlike many of LeBron's young fans today, I vividly remember Game 5 in 2007 and was completely awestruck by what I was watching. To me, not only was this game the most impressive I've seen from him, but I believe it was also the most meaningful. It's one thing to witness the triumphal, climactic moments of a player's career, but it's something else entirely to witness the origin story. This was the beginning of the LeBron James we know today. This was the moment where I knew as a young fan that the league would soon be owned by LeBron. This was the moment I realized that this young man may actually become better than Kobe, that he's every bit as good as people hyped him up to be, and that his nickname the King is very well deserved. Some of you have heard me talk about this hot take before, but back in the early to mid-2000s, there was a genuine debate on who was the better power forward, Tim Duncan or Kevin Garnett. In the years since, Duncan has vastly separated himself in the minds of almost everyone, and understandably so, as Duncan is a 5-time NBA champion, while Garnett only won the title once. But here's the thing, I honestly believe that the difference in championship win count has more to do with their teams and circumstances, rather than it being a reflection of their difference in talent. If you ask me, without question, Tim Duncan has a significantly better resume, and deserves to be way higher on the all-time list because of it. But from a pure talent perspective, from a pure skills perspective, and from the perspective of simply being a quality basketball player, I believe Kevin Garnett was every bit as good as Tim Duncan. This doesn't have anything to do with a negative view of Tim Duncan, but rather it has to do with my tremendous respect for Kevin Garnett's game. You have to remember, Tim Duncan spent his prime years with championship quality supporting talent, like the all-time great point guard Tony Parker, arguably the greatest sixth man ever Manu Ginobili, and perennial Defensive Player of the Year candidate Bruce Bowen. Not to mention how he started his career with the fellow all-time great big man David Robinson, and ended his career with guys like Kawhi Leonard and LaMarcus Aldridge. The best teammate Kevin Garnett had while he was in Minnesota was Wally freaking Szczerbiak. That is nowhere close to an equal amount of supporting talent to Tim Duncan. Garnett spent all of his prime years in Minnesota, which is the most losing franchise in NBA history. That's not an opinion, that is literally an objective fact, as they have 0 championships and the worst win-loss ratio of all time. Yes, eventually, Garnett got a ton of help in Boston, but by the time he got there, he was well into his 30s, and clearly wasn't still in the prime of his career. Yet he still won the Defensive Player of the Year in his first season in Boston, and won the NBA championship as arguably the best player on that team. Now to further get my point across, these are Tim Duncan's numbers leading up to KG being traded to the Boston Celtics, and these were the numbers of Garnett in Minnesota during that same 10-year stretch. As you can see, KG's level of production was just as good, if not better, during their primes. If I had to sum up the biggest difference between Tim Duncan's career and Kevin Garnett's career in just one word, I would say stability. Throughout the entirety of Tim Duncan's career, he played for one of the best franchises in basketball while having championship supporting talent around him. He played all 19 years of his career all on one team under just one head coach, and that coach is seen by many as the greatest head coach in NBA history. On the other hand, Garnett played 21 years in his career on 3 separate teams, and 14 of those 21 seasons were on the worst franchise in NBA history. In his career, he played under 9 different head coaches, and none of those were close to the level of accomplished that Greg Popovich is. Simply put, Tim Duncan was great, but he was also blessed with an extremely fortunate situation, while Kevin Garnett often had the deck stacked against him. I firmly believe that if you switch their teams throughout their careers, then we would be viewing Kevin Garnett as the greatest power forward in NBA history, and people would consider Tim Duncan as a distant second at best. My hope is not that anyone thinks less of Duncan because of this comparison, but instead that people would hold more respect for Garnett than what he's usually given. Am I alone on this? Possibly, but I witnessed both of their careers and both of their peaks, and I'm sticking with my hot take no matter how much heat it brings my way. When it comes to basketball discussions, there are genuine hot takes where most of the basketball community doesn't share the same view. But then there's an even more specific kind of hot take. It's one that's contrary to the popular belief, but it shouldn't be, because it's a fact and most people don't recognize it as such. Today, I'm breaking down my short list of hot takes that shouldn't be considered as hot. And let me know in the comments what are some of your hot takes as well. First off, Tim Duncan should not be classified as a power forward. Let me be clear, at times in the past I've referred to Duncan as a power forward, and I've even given him the label of the greatest power forward in NBA history. But after some recent consideration, I've kind of changed my mind on that perspective. Calling Tim Duncan a power forward is nice if you're a Tim Duncan fan, because it then puts him in a category where we can label him as the greatest ever at that position. But make no mistake, Duncan spent the vast majority of his basketball playing days as a center. Throughout all of his high school days and in his college years at Wake Forest, Duncan was the team's starting center. That was his natural position. The only reason why Duncan started his NBA career at the power forward position was because the San Antonio Spurs already had a perennial all-star center, which was David Robinson. and soon after Robinson retired, Duncan assumed his traditional position at the 5 spot. A lot of people don't realize this, but even with Duncan spending a significant amount of time at the power forward position while in San Antonio, he actually spent more seasons in the NBA at the center position than he did at power forward. When you add in his days in high school and college, then it's not even close. Duncan spent way more time playing at the 5 rather than the 4. On offense, Tim's game has always been a bit of a blend between a traditional center and a power forward, as he was usually willing to push his range out a bit with his signature bank shot. But especially on defense, he's always played as a defensive anchor in the paint and served as the team's primary rim protector, which is a classic trait of a traditional center. The only argument I can see for Duncan being labeled as a power forward is the fact that he played his best seasons at that position while David Robinson was still around. But by that logic, we should also be calling LeBron James a power forward, since that was his position during his peak years with the Miami Heat. And of course, absolutely no one makes the argument that LeBron should be ranked among the greatest power forwards of all time. From the standpoint of how we rank Tim Duncan on the overall all-time list, and as far as how we appreciate him as one of the greatest players of all time, this topic of his position shouldn't really affect any of that. I just think we should be genuine when discussing the greatest players at each position. And if anything, Duncan should be in the discussion of the greatest centers of all time. What's interesting though is the question of who becomes the greatest power forward of all time if we justifiably remove Tim Duncan from the conversation. Suddenly, it becomes a very competitive race. Let me know who is your choice in the comments section below. My next hot take that shouldn't be hot is that the gap between Paul Pierce and Dwayne Wade isn't all that big. Pierce was the one who initially lit the internet on fire when he made this comparison. And not just Jalen Rose and Michelle Beadle, but seemingly everyone was continuously roasting him for it. Even after all the public shaming, Pierce recently doubled down on a podcast, as he clearly believes he's on that level.
Put Shaq on my team, put LeBron and Bosh with me. I'm not gonna win one? You don't think? You put me, LeBron, and
Isaiah Thomas said.
Me, LeBron, and Bosh. We not gonna win one?
Yeah.
We not gonna win a couple? Like, who's the better three-point shooter?
Yeah,
sure,
yeah.
Is he a better scorer? Is he a better scorer? Okay.
Listen, like most people, I'm taking D Wade in that comparison, as he was clearly the more accomplished player, and he was also the better defensive player. But again, the gap isn't as big as many people think, and I have no problems with Paul Pierce believing this. I mean, Pierce does make some valid points. He was a better three-point shooter than Wade, and as far as an overall scorer, Pierce wasn't just good, but he was one of the very best. Over a 5-year stretch, from the 2000 to 2001 season through the 04 to 05 season, Pierce was 3rd overall in scoring. He scored more points in that 5-year stretch than Shaquille O'Neal, Dirk Nowitzki, Vince Carter, and Kobe Bryant. Many of those players were often torched on the court as well, like when he dropped 42 points against Shaq and Kobe while earning the nickname The Truth, or like when he dropped 50 points on LeBron James and the Cleveland Cavaliers in 2006. He was also a very explosive scorer when he needed to be, like when he dropped 46 points in the second half alone against the New Jersey Nets in 2001. Like Pierce mentioned, during his prime years, he didn't have the luxury of playing alongside of Shaquille O'Neal, LeBron James, and Chris Bosh. Sure, he had some quality help, like a co-star in Antoine Walker, but it wasn't until he got legitimate Hall of Fame help that he immediately won a championship at the age of 30. Ultimately, I'm taking Wade over Pierce. But unlike most people, I'm not laughing at Pierce or mocking him for believing this. He was certainly good enough to warrant this kind of confidence. My last hot take that shouldn't be hot is that Larry Bird was actually an elite defensive player. For those of you who have been longtime viewers of my channel, you've certainly heard me talk about this several times before. Unfortunately, so many people still don't get it, so I'm including it again in another video. For some reason, when you get an unathletic looking white guy, people just automatically assume he can't play defense. It's not just Larry Bird who suffers from this. Dan Marley is often a player who is criticized as a plumber from the Jordan era, when in reality, Thunder Dan was incredibly fit and was one of the best defensive players of his era. But back to Larry Bird. Larry Legend was the leader of the Boston Celtics throughout the 1980s, who were consistently among the best teams in the league defensively. That wasn't mere coincidence, as Bird was known for playing with intensity, energy, and effort every time he set foot on the court. And as a leader, he expected the same from his teammates. On an individual level, Bird certainly proved himself as well. In his career, he made 3 All-Defense teams, and in 1983, he tied for 3rd place in the Defensive Player of the Year voting, receiving as many votes as all-time great defenders like Michael Cooper and Bobby Jones. Not only was Bird a solid on-ball defender, but his quick hands and high defensive IQ enabled him to get a ton of steals, and over his career, he averaged 1.7 steals per game. From his rookie season until the 1988 season, Bird got nearly 1,300 steals, which is the 4th most in the entire league over that stretch of time. And what's even more impressive is that among non-guards, that was the most in the entire league. Not many players in the history of the NBA have ever got 8 steals in a single game. Larry Bird did that 3 times, including his 9-steal game in 1985, where he nearly had a quadruple-double in only 3 quarters of play. If Larry Legend had played in the 4th quarter of that game, then he likely would be the all-time record holder for the most steals in a single game, which is held by Kendall Gill with a total of 11. You also have to consider how Bird was a versatile defensive player, and with his 6'9" frame, he was very capable of guarding multiple positions. When his career began, he actually started as a power forward, guarding some of the strongest players in the league. Due to the emergence of Kevin McHale, Bird eventually moved to the small forward spot and started guarding elite wings. Simply put, way too many people say that Bird was a subpar defensive player, and hardly anyone says that he was an elite defensive player, but that's exactly what he was. At the end of the day, these are just my hot takes that I don't believe should be considered as hot. What are yours? I look forward to hearing your takes in the comments section below. I realize that this video's thumbnail and title may be triggering to some of you, but I honestly think that if you hear my thought process behind this video, you'll understand where I'm coming from, and you might even have some suggestions of your own. So listen, I've been following the NBA for a long time. I'm quickly approaching my mid-30s, and I've been obsessively watching the game since I was about 5 years old. Based on that fact, my watched experience goes all the way back to the mid-90s. But the truth is, I was actually watching games from long before that. Back in the day, we didn't have TiVo, YouTube, or even the internet. If there was a remarkable game or highlight that you wanted to rewatch, then you had to record it on VHS tapes. That's exactly what my dad did to an obsessive extent, as he recorded every playoff game, all-star game, and some regular season games on VHS tapes throughout the 80s and 90s. This was the root of my passion for basketball, as I was addicted to these tapes. And while other 5-year-old children were watching things like Barney, I was busy watching my dad's tapes of 1980s basketball on repeat. And to this day, I still have cardboard boxes full of VHS tapes of past generations. That's how I'm so familiar with eras that I technically didn't live through, but I certainly feel like I did. All this goes to say, I've seen a lot of NBA basketball throughout the years, and I've witnessed the narratives and perceptions change about players as time has gone on. I've seen guys be considered as top 5 players in the game, just to be forgotten and only discussed by the most hardcore basketball fans 20 years later. Since I've been watching the sport for so long, I think I've started to recognize the trends, and players who may seem like famous superstars that everybody knows about, but decades from now, general audiences won't be talking about them as much. Obviously, you guys will remember these players since you lived to watch them. But trust me, 20 to 30 years from now, you'll be in my position, and you'll discover that general audiences don't talk about them as much as they should. So now, here's my short list of players who won't be remembered decades from now. First off, Damian Lillard. Let me first clarify, since Lillard is an active player, he's subject to change, as he may very well join a super team, win a championship, and add accolades to his legacy in the near future. But as things currently stand, he is the perfect candidate for a player who won't be talked about decades from now. The way I see him is that he's a modern day version of Alex English in the 1980s, who's a player that only the most hardcore basketball fans ever talk about. Obviously, these two players were at different positions. They had different builds, and they had vastly different play styles. But when it comes to the aspects that make up a legacy, they're pretty darn similar. Damian Lillard was one of the best scorers of his generation, and so was Alex English, as no player scored more total points than English in the 1980s. Both athletes were the best players for their respective small market teams for many years, but neither superstar ever won an NBA championship. Neither star has any MVPs or very much hardware in general. Neither player was considered as a quality defender, and both players were overshadowed by other superstars with more stacked teams. Sure, Lillard has some incredible individual performances on his resume, but so does English. So do guys like Tom Chambers and Dominique Wilkins. And again, only the most hardcore basketball fans ever talk about these guys. Now things could change. If he wins an NBA championship, then he'll certainly be immortalized. Or even just a trip to the NBA Finals and a historic performance could possibly give him the Allen Iverson treatment. Now this doesn't apply to Blazer fans and diehard basketball fans, because you're still the minority in the grand scheme of things. If Lillard is going to have a legacy that lasts for decades to come, then something needs to change within his resume, and it needs to change soon. Second up is Paul George. For a while, this player has been considered as one of the best two-way players in the entire league, and he was even considered as an MVP candidate for a short period of time. But guess what? Many other great players of the past can make those same claims, but have since been forgotten. Players like Sidney Moncrief, Nate Thurmond, and Alvin Robertson were elite two-way players in their day, yet they're rarely mentioned in the modern era. Oftentimes, players' legacies are sustained by the iconic images that we remember them for. Without a single NBA Finals appearance, and with such a poor track record in game-winning situations, unfortunately, George won't have many iconic highlights that will stand the test of time. Think about it. Consider your favorite legend from the NBA's past and picture one iconic highlight that you remember from their career. When did it take place, and what was the situation? Without the gravity of the moment, even great players can appear as basic stats when enough time has passed. Also, I hate to be this brutal, but I would argue that from a legacy standpoint, the most memorable aspect of George's career was his Pandemic P nickname, based on his lackluster performance in the 2020 postseason. 20 years from now, people probably won't be talking about that, but the image of him clanking the side of the backboard is certainly ingrained in my memory. I'm not trying to be harsh, I'm trying to be honest. Legends are remembered mostly for three things: rings, records, and moments. Without any of those three things working in your favor, you're basically swimming upstream when it comes to building your legacy. Last on the list is Joe Johnson. ISO Joe was one of the great one-on-one players who was extremely skilled offensively. He's the only retired player on this list, but in many ways, I think he also fits this criteria. He had a lot of quality traits that should be remembered. For one, he was incredibly difficult to stop in his prime, averaging as high as 25 points per game in 2007. What I personally appreciate about him is how he was one of the most clutch shot makers in the history of the game, and I say that with zero hesitation. It depends on how you define a game-winning shot, but based on the most common definitions, Johnson is either in the top 5 or the top 10 spots for the most game-winning shots in NBA history. Unfortunately, I don't think this is something that general audiences will know about a couple decades from now, because ISO Joe never received much hardware, and none of his teams ever made it to the NBA Finals. Most of his greatest moments simply came in regular season games, on teams that were good, but were almost never expected to win a championship. In a similar fashion to an extremely clutch player like Baron Davis, I think the appreciation of Johnson will dwindle over time, as his impact slowly starts to appear as empty stats on teams that were almost never serious contenders. So what do you guys think? Who's a star player that people will almost never be talking about 20 years from now? I look forward to hearing your opinions in the comments section below. Thanks for watching as always, make sure to like and subscribe for more basketball content, and I'll see you guys in the next video.